Admiral J1 arrived at the front lines with a fleet that looked nothing like the elegant ships of the Galactic Council. His vessels were painted in dark colors, designed to blend with the emptiness of space, rather than display the proud symbols of their civilization. Human ships carried no diplomatic equipment or cultural exchange facilities. Instead, every inch of space was devoted to weapons systems and tactical equipment. The first engagement between human forces and the Vorthan Empire took place near the ruins of the Andorian system. The Vorthan had expected another conventional attack, like all the previous battles they had won. Instead, they encountered tactics that seemed to make no military sense at all. Captain So Young commanded a small strike force that approached the Vorthan supply convoy through an asteroid field. Rather than attacking directly, her ships hid among the floating rocks and began broadcasting false communications. The transmissions were designed to look like internal Vorthan messages reporting suspicious behavior among fleet commanders. The human psychological warfare specialists had studied, captured Vorthan communications, and learned to mimic their hive mind command structure. The false messages suggested that some Vorthan commanders were developing individual thoughts that conflicted with the collective consciousness. This created something the Vorthan had never experienced before: paranoia within their own ranks instead of destroying. The supply convoy Captain So Young forces let it continue to its destination, but not before planting sophisticated listening devices and data corruption programs. The Vorthan delivered the compromised supplies to 3 different fleet bases, spreading the false intelligence throughout their command network. Within days, the Vorthan hive mind began experiencing internal conflicts as different sectors received contradictory information about potential traitors. The collective consciousness that had been their greatest strength became a weakness as suspicion and confusion spread through their networks like a virus. The Vorthan response was predictable but devastating to their own forces. The hive mind began purging commanders and entire units that showed any signs of independent thinking. This eliminated some of their most experienced tactical leaders and created gaps in their command structure that human forces quickly exploited. Admiral Kyung-soo watched the results from his command ship with a mixture of admiration and horror. The human tactics had achieved what months of conventional warfare had failed to accomplish. They had actually forced the Vorthan to retreat from occupied systems. But the methods used disturbed many of the galactic officers. Human forces did not fight like civilized species. They used deception as a primary weapon, rather than a last resort. They attacked enemy morale and psychology with the same intensity that others applied to destroying ships and weapons. Their goal was not just to defeat the Vorthan, but to make them defeat themselves. Colonel Minho developed the next phase of human strategy based on detailed analysis of Vorthan behavior patterns. His teams had discovered that the hive mind relied on constant communication between all units. Any disruption in these communications caused confusion and tactical errors. Human cyber warfare specialists created virus programs that could infiltrate Vorthan communication networks and introduce subtle errors in their coordination. These viruses did not destroy information, but instead changed small details that accumulated into major tactical mistakes. The effects were spectacular. Vorthan fleets began arriving at wrong coordinates, missing their targets by millions of kilometers. Supply ships delivered weapons to the wrong units, leaving some forces without ammunition, while others were oversupplied with equipment they could not use. The psychological impact on individual Vorthan drones was even more significant. As communication errors increased, many drones began experiencing something they had never known before: doubt about the infallibility of the hive mind. Some drones actually began showing signs of independent thought. Human forces exploited these weaknesses with tactics that horrified their galactic allies. When Vorthan drones showed signs of individual thinking instead of capturing them for study, human psychological warfare teams would amplify these thoughts. The goal was to spread the contagion of individuality throughout the Vorthan collective. Dr. Eugene made a breakthrough that changed the entire nature of the conflict. She discovered that the Vorthan hive mind had a fatal blind spot: it could not understand the concept of individual sacrifice for abstract principles. This uniquely human trait became the foundation for new tactical approaches. Human military units began using kamikaze attacks and sacrificial strategies that the Vorthan tactical computers could not predict or counter. Small human ships would deliberately sacrifice themselves to create opportunities for larger strikes. Individual soldiers would accept certain death to complete missions that saved civilian populations. These actions confused the Vorthan hive mind, which calculated the value of every action based on resource cost and tactical advantage. The idea that individuals would willingly destroy themselves for concepts like honor duty or the protection of strangers made no sense to the collective consciousness. The confusion spread through Vorthan networks as their tactical computers struggled to predict enemy actions that followed no logical pattern. The hive mind began developing what could only be described as anxiety, constantly trying to anticipate human moves that seemed to violate all principles of rational behavior. Admiral Jaewon coordinated a series of attacks that demonstrated the full scope of human tactical thinking. Rather than trying to match Vorthan firepower, human forces would create chaos and uncertainty that forced the enemy to make mistakes. In the Battle of the Centauri Nebula, human forces used the cosmic dust clouds to hide their movements, but more importantly, they used the environment to create false sensor readings that confused Vorthan navigation systems. Entire enemy fleets became lost in space, while human ships with inferior technology managed to coordinate perfectly. The key to human success was their willingness to use every possible advantage without regard for traditional military ethics. They attacked enemy supply lines, civilian infrastructure, and even medical facilities, if doing so would weaken Vorthan resistance. Galactic Council forces struggled to adapt to these new tactics. Many species found human methods disturbing and dishonorable. Some alien commanders refused to coordinate with human units because they disagreed with their approach to warfare. President He-jin faced increasing pressure from council members who argued that human methods were worse than Vorthan conquest. At least the Vorthan were honest about their brutality, while humans claimed to be fighting for freedom and civilization while using tactics that seemed equally ruthless. But the results could not be argued. The Vorthan advance had stopped for the first time in the war. Enemy forces were retreating from multiple systems, and their hive mind showed signs of internal breakdown. Human tactics were working even if the methods disturbed their allies. Captain So-young reported that Vorthan drones were beginning to surrender, something that had never happened before. The combination of psychological warfare and tactical confusion had created cracks in the collective consciousness that grew larger with each engagement. The galaxy watched in stunned amazement as human forces achieved impossible victories through methods that challenged every assumption about civilized warfare. The Vorthan Empire that had seemed unstoppable was being defeated by a species that most civilizations had considered primitive. Admiral Kyung-soo stood on the bridge of his massive warship watching the screens with growing fear. The images showed destruction beyond anything he had ever seen before. Entire star systems that had thrived for thousands of years were now empty, space filled only with debris and the lingering energy signatures of weapons too powerful to comprehend. The Vorthan Empire had appeared from the dark regions of space like a nightmare made real. Their black ships moved through the galaxy, consuming everything in their path. They did not simply conquer worlds like other aggressive species had done throughout history. Instead, they harvested entire planets, stripping them of all resources and converting the populations into twisted creatures that served their hive mind. Kyung-soo received another distress signal from the Kepler system. The message was brief and filled with static, but the meaning was clear. The last remaining defense fleet was being overwhelmed. The Vorthan bioweapons were eating through the hull of every ship they touched, turning advanced starships into floating tombs within minutes. The communication ended abruptly, leaving only the sound of his own breathing in the sudden silence. Kyung-soo had commanded fleets for over 30 years, but he had never faced an enemy like this. The Vorthan seemed to have no weaknesses. Their ships repaired themselves faster than conventional weapons could damage them. Their tactics adapted to every strategy the Council forces tried. President He-jin called for an emergency session of the Galactic Council representatives from hundreds of worlds gathered in the Great Chamber on the neutral world of Sanctuary. The usual diplomatic ceremonies were abandoned as species reported the same terrible news. The ethereal collective had been the first major civilization to fall. Their home system had been one of the most beautiful in the galaxy, filled with energy beings who had mastered the forces of creation itself. Yet the Vorthan had consumed them in less than 6 hours. The survivors spoke of weapons that could drain the life force from entire planets, leaving nothing but cold, dead rocks floating in space. The Mechanical Nexus Union had lasted longer, but their defeat was perhaps even more disturbing. The Vorthan had used some kind of virus that turned the Union machines against their creators. The proud robot civilization had been forced to watch their own technology become weapons of mass destruction controlled by the enemy hive mind. Even the mighty Krulon warrior race had fallen. The Krulon were famous throughout the galaxy for their combat skills and their honor in battle. They had never lost a war in their 10,000-year history, yet now their survivors huddled in refugee camps speaking in whispers about enemies that felt no pain and showed no mercy. President Hai Jin looked around the chamber at the frightened faces of the galaxy's most powerful leaders she had served as president for 15 years, guiding the council through trade disputes and minor conflicts. But this was different. The Vorthan represented an existential threat to every living being in the galaxy. The reports continued, each one more disturbing than the last. The Vorthan did not take prisoners. They converted captured beings into drone soldiers that retained just enough of their original memories to feel the horror of what they had become. These drones were then used as weapons against their former allies, creating a psychological warfare that broke the spirit of defending forces. Traditional military doctrine seemed useless against such an enemy. The council fleets were designed for battles between civilized species, where rules of engagement and concepts of honor still mattered. The Vorthan followed no such rules. They attacked civilian targets, medical ships, and even religious sites with the same cold efficiency. Admiral Kyung-soo presented the latest tactical analysis to the council. The numbers were stark. At current rates of loss, the combined fleets of all council species would be eliminated within 18 months. The Vorthan advance showed no signs of slowing, and their forces seemed to grow stronger with each victory. The chamber fell silent as the implications became clear. This was not a war that could be won through conventional means. The greatest military minds in the galaxy had tried every possible strategy. Advanced technology that had taken millennia to develop was proving useless against an enemy that seemed to exist beyond the normal rules of physics and biology. Some council members suggested retreat to the far edges of the galaxy. Perhaps they could hide in the dark spaces between stars and wait for the Vorthan to move on to other targets. But intelligence reports suggested that the Vorthan were not just conquering. They were systematically harvesting the entire galaxy. Running would only delay the inevitable, others proposed desperate measures. Perhaps they could develop new weapons of mass destruction that could match Vorthan firepower. But such weapons would take years to create, and testing them might destroy the very worlds they were trying to protect. The ethical implications alone made many species reject such ideas. President Hai Jin knew that conventional solutions would not work. The council needed something unexpected, something that the Vorthan hive mind could not predict or counter. She turned to the ancient archives, searching for any information about species or technologies that might offer hope. Deep in the historical records, she found references to a small world called Earth, located in a remote spiral arm of the galaxy. The planet was home to a species called humans who had only recently developed space travel. Most galactic civilizations had ignored them, considering their technology too primitive to be useful. But the old exploration reports contained some interesting details. Humans had emerged from a world of constant conflict where survival required not just intelligence, but also creativity and warfare. They had developed weapons and tactics that seemed unnecessarily complex and brutal compared to other species, though. Reports described human history as an endless series of wars where weaker forces had somehow defeated stronger enemies through unconventional methods. The humans seemed to view warfare not as an unfortunate necessity, but as a complex science that could be studied and perfected. Most council members would consider contacting such a primitive species to be a waste of valuable time. But President Hai Jin remembered an old saying from her homeworld. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources. The galaxy was dying and traditional methods had failed. Perhaps it was time to try something completely different. She authorized a diplomatic mission to make contact with Earth. The message would be simple. The galaxy needed help, and humans were being offered a chance to join the fight against an enemy that threatened all life. Some council members protested that involving primitives would only lead to more casualties. But President Hai-Jin had made her decision. The Vorthan hive mind had proven superior to every advanced civilization in the galaxy. Perhaps what they needed was not more advanced thinking, but rather a completely different approach to the problem of survival. As the diplomatic ship prepared to depart for Earth, nobody in the council could have imagined what they were about to unleash. The galaxy was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous weapons are not the most advanced ones, but rather the most unexpected ones. Captain Dong-hyun was conducting a routine patrol near the edge of human space when his communications officer detected the strange transmission. The signal was unlike anything in human databases, using quantum encryption methods that Earth scientists had only theorized about. The message itself was even more surprising than its advanced delivery method. The transmission contained a desperate plea from something called the Galactic Council. An entire galaxy was under attack by an enemy called the Vorthan Empire. Billions of civilizations were being destroyed, and the Council was reaching out to every species they could contact for help. Captain Dong-hyun realized that humanity was being invited to join an intergalactic war. He immediately transmitted the message to Earth, where it reached the offices of General Na-young, who commanded the Global Defense Initiative. The GDI was humanity's secret space program that had been preparing for alien contact for over 50 years. What made the program unique was its focus on military applications rather than peaceful exploration. General Na-young had spent her entire career studying human warfare and developing new combat doctrines. Her teams had analyzed every major battle in human history, looking for patterns and principles that could be applied to future conflicts. The GDI had always assumed that first contact with aliens would likely involve some form of conflict. The Galactic Council message was translated and analyzed by the best human linguists and strategists. What they discovered was both fascinating and disturbing. The galaxy was filled with advanced civilizations that had apparently never learned how to fight a real war. Their military thinking seemed focused on honor and rules rather than victory and survival. General Na-young called together her top advisors to discuss humanity response. The room was filled with experts in psychological warfare, asymmetric tactics, and unconventional weapon systems. These were people who understood that wars were not won by having the best technology, but by using whatever advantages you possessed more effectively than your enemies. Colonel Min-ho presented the tactical analysis of the Vorthan threat. The enemy seemed to possess superior technology and numbers. Their hive mind coordination gave them advantages that individual species could not match. Their bioweapons and self-repairing ships made conventional military responses ineffective. But as the human analysts studied the reports, they began to see weaknesses that the advanced galactic civilizations had missed. The Vorthan hive mind that made them so coordinated also made them predictable. Their rapid adaptation to enemy tactics suggested they relied on pattern recognition rather than true creativity. Dr. Yu Jin, who specialized in alien psychology, pointed out something interesting. The Vorthans seemed to expect their enemies to fight in predictable ways. When faced with unconventional tactics, they showed signs of confusion and delayed responses. This suggested that their hive mind, while powerful, had significant blind spots. General Na-young made the decision that would change galactic history. Humanity would join the fight against the Vorthan, but they would do so on their own terms. Human forces would not follow galactic military conventions or try to match Vorthan technology. Instead, they would use the one advantage that humans possessed better than any other species: the ability to think creatively about warfare. The human response to the Galactic Council surprised everyone. Instead of asking about defensive strategies or requesting advanced weapons, humans wanted detailed intelligence about Vorthan psychology supply lines and command structure. They seemed less interested in fighting honorably than in finding ways to win decisively. Captain Dong-hyun was given command of the first human fleet to leave Earth. The ships were smaller than galactic standard warships, but They carried weapons and equipment that reflected thousands of years of human military innovation. Nuclear weapons that other species had abandoned as too destructive cyber warfare systems designed to disrupt enemy communications, psychological warfare equipment that could broadcast propaganda directly into enemy minds. The human soldiers preparing for departure were trained differently than galactic military forces, while other species emphasized honor and following rules of engagement. Humans trained their soldiers to exploit enemy weaknesses without regard for traditional military ethics. Human military academies taught that the only rule in warfare was to win. When Captain Dong-hyun's fleet arrived at the staging area near Council headquarters, the alien representatives were shocked by what they saw. Human ships looked aggressive and threatening rather than sleek and beautiful. Human weapons were designed for maximum destruction rather than precise surgical strikes. Admiral Kyung-soo met with the human commanders to coordinate joint operations. He was disturbed by their casual attitude toward what other species considered war crimes. The humans spoke openly about using deception, psychological manipulation, and attacks on enemy morale as primary tactical tools. General Na Young explained human military philosophy to the confused alien officers. Humans had evolved on a world where survival required constant adaptation to new threats. Every human innovation in warfare had come from facing enemies with superior advantages. The key to human success was never fighting fair if you could avoid it. The galactic officers struggled to understand this concept. Their own military traditions emphasized courage, honor, and following established rules of combat. They built beautiful ships and elegant weapons that reflected their advanced civilizations and high moral standards. Human military equipment looked crude and brutal by comparison. But as General Na Young pointed out, beauty and elegance were useless if they did not help you win battles. Human weapons were designed by people who understood that war was about survival, not about impressing your enemies with your technological achievements. President Hai-jin met privately with the human leadership to discuss their planned role in the war. She was both hopeful and nervous about what humanity might contribute. The humans seemed confident that they could make a difference, but their methods were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The human plan was elegantly simple rather than trying to match Vorthon advantages. They would create chaos and confusion in enemy operations. They would use guerrilla tactics, psychological warfare, and strategic deception to force the Vorthon to fight on human terms. As news spread through the galaxy that humans were joining, the war reactions were mixed. Some species welcomed any help against the Vorthon threat. Others worried that inviting such a primitive and aggressive species might create new problems. Even if the humans helped defeat the Vorthon, what would happen to the galaxy afterward? The human fleet departed for the front lines carrying weapons and tactics that the galaxy had never imagined. Their ships broadcast no messages of peace or diplomacy. Instead, they transmitted psychological warfare signals designed to create fear and uncertainty in enemy forces. Captain Dong-hyun looked at the star charts showing Vorthon-controlled territory. The enemy had conquered vast regions of space using superior technology and coordinated tactics, but they were about to face something they had never encountered before. An enemy that fought not for honor or glory, but for the simple, brutal purpose of complete victory. Colonel Minho stood in his laboratory surrounded by captured Vorthon technology that had been reverse-engineered by human scientists. The equipment looked alien and beautiful, with organic curves and surfaces that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. But Minho was not interested in the aesthetic qualities of enemy technology. He was focused on turning it into weapons. The breakthrough came when his team discovered that Vorthon biotechnology was designed to interface directly with the hive mind consciousness. Every piece of equipment was connected to the collective through quantum communication networks that allowed instant coordination across vast distances. This connection was their strength, but Minho realized it could also be their greatest weakness. Human neuroscientists had been studying the psychological effects of individual consciousness versus collective thinking. They discovered that human emotions created unique quantum signatures that were completely incompatible with hive mind processing. When exposed to human emotional patterns, Vorthon technology experienced something similar to system crashes. Dr. Yu Jin worked with Minho team to develop what they called emotional warfare weapons. These devices could broadcast human feelings directly into Vorthon communication networks. The results were devastating to the enemy collective consciousness, which had no framework for processing individual emotional experiences. The first test of the emotional warfare system took place during the siege of the Proxima station. A small human ship approached a Vorthon blockade fleet and began broadcasting recordings of human soldiers saying goodbye to their families before dangerous missions. The emotional content of these messages created chaos in the Vorthon network. Vorthon drones began experiencing something they had never felt before: longing for individual relationships and fear of personal death. These emotions were completely alien to the hive mind, which responded by trying to purge the affected units. But the emotional virus spread faster than it could be contained. Captain So Young observed the effects from her command ship. The Vorthon fleet that had maintained perfect formation for weeks began breaking apart as individual ships started behaving erratically. Some drones actually abandoned their posts and tried to flee, while others became paralyzed by the unfamiliar experience of personal fear. The psychological breakdown of the Vorthon forces was accelerated by another human innovation. Dr. Eugene had developed a method for broadcasting the concept of individual identity directly into alien minds. For species that had evolved collective consciousness, this was more devastating than any physical weapon. Human forces began using suicide tactics that exploited the Vorthon inability to understand personal sacrifice. Individual human soldiers would pilot small ships directly into enemy vessels, not just to cause damage, but to broadcast their final thoughts and emotions into the Vorthon network. These kamikaze attacks created a cascade effect throughout the hive mind, as Vorthon drones were exposed to the human concept of willing self-sacrifice. For abstract principles, the collective consciousness could not process the idea that individuals would choose death for concepts like honor duty or love. Admiral J. Wan coordinated these psychological attacks with conventional military strikes. The combination was more effective than anyone had predicted. Vorthon forces would be thrown into confusion by emotional warfare, just as human kinetic weapons arrived to exploit their disorganization. The tide of the war began turning as human tactics proved successful across multiple fronts. Vorthon fleets that had been unstoppable now retreated when faced with human psychological weapons. The hive mind that had coordinated their empire was breaking down under the assault of individual consciousness. General Young received reports from across the galaxy that showed the scope of human success. Vorthon-occupied worlds were experiencing uprisings as converted populations began recovering their individual identities. The emotional warfare broadcasts were having effects far beyond their intended military targets, but the human methods continued to disturb their galactic allies. Admiral Kyung-soo requested a meeting with human commanders to discuss what he considered excessive brutality. The use of suicide attacks and psychological torture weapons violated every principle of civilized warfare. Colonel Min-ho explained the human perspective to the alien officers. Humans had learned through thousands of years of warfare that victory required using every possible advantage. The Vorthon were an existential threat to all life in the galaxy, which justified any tactics that could defeat them. The galactic representatives struggled to understand this logic. Their own military traditions emphasized honor and following rules of engagement even when facing extinction. They could not accept that survival might require abandoning the principles that defined their civilizations. Dr. Yu Jin presented her latest research, which showed that the Vorthon hive mind was beginning to fragment into smaller collective units. These fragments were less coordinated than the original empire, but they were also developing new characteristics that resembled individual thinking. Some Vorthon fragments were actually attempting to communicate with human forces using concepts like negotiation and compromise. These ideas had never existed in the original hive mind, which only understood domination and absorption. The psychological warfare was literally creating new forms of Vorthon consciousness. The implications were staggering. Humans were not just defeating the Vorthon Empire, they were fundamentally changing the nature of the enemy species. The collective consciousness that had made them a galactic threat was being replaced by something closer to individual awareness. Captain Dong-hyun commanded a fleet that encountered one of these fragmented Vorthon groups near the edge of former enemy territory. The Vorthon ships approached under a flag of truce and actually requested permission to communicate. This had never happened before in the war. The conversation that followed was unprecedented. The fragmented Vorthon collective had developed enough individual awareness to question their own previous actions. They expressed something that seemed like regret for the destruction they had caused and requested information about human concepts like forgiveness and redemption. Human psychological warfare. Specialists realized they had achieved something beyond military victory. They had created the possibility of actually converting enemy forces, rather than simply destroying them. The Vorthon fragments that embraced individual consciousness became potential allies rather than threats. But this success created new problems for the galactic community. Many species were horrified by the idea that human weapons could fundamentally alter the consciousness of other beings. The power to change how aliens thought was perhaps more frightening than the ability to destroy them. President He Jin faced difficult questions from council members who wanted to know if human psychological weapons could be used against other species. The technology that was saving the galaxy from the Vorthon could potentially be used to control any civilization. General Na Young addressed these concerns by pointing out that human weapons were specifically designed to exploit Vorthon hive mind weaknesses. They would not be effective against species that already possessed individual consciousness. But many galactic leaders remained suspicious of human capabilities. The war was clearly turning in favor of the Galactic Alliance, but the methods being used to achieve victory were changing the fundamental nature of warfare itself. Human innovations in psychological combat were creating new categories of weapons that many species considered more dangerous than traditional military equipment. As Vorthon resistance continued to collapse, the galaxy began to realize that defeating this enemy was only the beginning. The real challenge would be dealing with the aftermath of a war where humans had proven that consciousness itself could be weaponized. Ambassador Tae-hee stood before the emergency session of the Galactic Council, facing accusations that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Human forces were being called war criminals by the same species they were fighting to protect. The irony was not lost on her as she prepared to defend methods that had saved billions of lives. The council chamber was divided into two distinct groups: species that had directly benefited from human military intervention, supported, continued cooperation despite their discomfort with human tactics. Those whose worlds remained safely behind the front lines demanded that human forces be recalled and their weapons banned. Representative Zolkan of the Alterian Defense Fleet spoke first. His people had been among the first to face Vorthon invasion, and human tactics had saved their remaining colonies. But even he struggled to justify what he had witnessed during the liberation campaigns. The humans had used Vorthon prisoners as unwilling test subjects for psychological weapons. Broadcasting captured enemy thoughts into active combat zones while forcing the prisoners to experience human emotions until their hive mind connection was permanently severed. These methods had been effective, but they violated every principle of prisoner treatment. Ambassador Tae-hee responded that human forces were fighting an enemy that converted prisoners into weapons against their former allies. The Vorthon had shown no mercy to captured populations, turning entire civilizations into drone armies. Traditional prisoner protocols were designed for conflicts between rational opponents, not hive-minded parasites. President He Jin found herself in an impossible position. The human methods that horrified many council members had achieved what conventional warfare could not. The Vorthon advance had been stopped, and their empire was fragmenting into smaller, less dangerous units. But the cost of victory was challenging the moral foundation of galactic civilization. The debate became heated when Colonel Minho was called to testify about his emotional warfare weapons. Several council members accused him of developing methods that could be used to control any species, not just the Vorthon. The implications of weaponized consciousness frightened civilizations across the galaxy. Colonel Minho explained that his weapons were specifically designed to exploit the unique weaknesses of hive mind consciousness. Species with individual awareness would not be vulnerable to the same techniques, but his explanations did little to calm fears about human capabilities. Dr. Yu Jin presented her research on the psychological effects of the weapons she had developed. The Vorthon fragments that had been exposed to human consciousness were showing signs of genuine individual awareness. Some had even requested asylum, rather than returning to what remained of their collective. The transformation of enemy forces into potential refugees created legal and ethical challenges that the Council had never faced before. What rights did artificially created individual consciousnesses have? How should the galaxy deal with former enemies who claimed to have been fundamentally changed by human weapons? Some species argued that the human methods were a form of genocide against collective consciousness. Even if the individual Vorthon fragments were now peaceful, the original hive mind culture had been essentially destroyed. This raised questions about whether humans had the right to eliminate entire forms of awareness. Representative Haesung of the Ethereal Collective raised the most disturbing question of all. If humans could weaponize individual consciousness, what would prevent them from using these capabilities against other species in future conflicts? The power to alter how beings thought was perhaps the ultimate form of domination. General Nayung addressed the Council with characteristic directness. Human forces had been invited to join a war against an existential threat. They had used the most effective methods available to achieve victory. The alternative had been the extinction of galactic civilization. She pointed out that every species in the Council had benefited from human tactics, even those who now criticized them. The moral objections being raised were a luxury that would not have been possible if the Vorthon had continued their advance. Human methods might be disturbing, but they had preserved the freedom to make moral choices. The military situation complicated the political debate. Admiral Kyung-soo reported that Vorthon resistance was collapsing across multiple fronts, but scattered hive mind fragments were still capable of devastating attacks. Without continued human support, the war could still be lost. Captain So-young testified about the most controversial human operation to date. When Vorthon forces had used civilian populations as human shields, her unit had refused to retreat instead. They had developed precision tactics that saved the civilians while destroying the enemy forces. The operation had been successful, but the methods required had pushed the boundaries of what even humans considered acceptable psychological warfare. Specialists had forced captured Vorthon drones to experience the terror of the civilians they were threatening. The emotional feedback had caused a cascade failure in local hive mind networks. The civilians had been saved, but the psychological torture of enemy prisoners had violated protocols that even human forces normally followed. Captain So-young defended the action by pointing out that conventional rescue operations would have failed, resulting in civilian deaths. Commander Ji-woo provided the most disturbing testimony of all. His forces had encountered Vorthon units that were attempting to surrender, but their hive mind conditioning made genuine surrender impossible. The collective consciousness would reassert control within hours, turning surrendering drones back into active enemies. Human forces had solved this problem by severing the hive mind connection permanently using methods that essentially gave the drones artificial individual consciousness. But the process was irreversible, and many of the affected Vorthon suffered psychological trauma from the sudden transition to individual awareness. The Council faced an unprecedented ethical dilemma. The human methods that were winning the war were also fundamentally altering the nature of conflict itself. Traditional concepts of honorable warfare seemed inadequate when facing enemies that could not be defeated through conventional means. Some species began secretly developing defenses against human psychological weapons, just in case future conflicts arose. The technology that was saving the galaxy was also creating new forms of distrust and suspicion between former allies. Ambassador Tae-hee concluded her defense by asking the Council to consider the alternative. If human forces were recalled and their methods banned, what would happen when the next existential threat emerged? Would the galaxy choose extinction over using unpleasant but effective tactics? The vote on continued human participation was close, but the pragmatic need for victory outweighed moral objections. Human forces would continue their operations, but under increased oversight from Council observers. The galaxy would accept salvation, but they would watch their saviors very carefully. President Hyjin announced that human weapons technology would be classified at the highest levels and restricted to use only against hive mind enemies. But the knowledge of what was possible could not be erased. The galaxy had learned that consciousness itself could be weaponized. As the session ended, Species representatives gathered in small groups discussing the implications of what they had witnessed. Humans had proven themselves to be invaluable allies, but they had also demonstrated capabilities that made them potentially terrifying enemies. The war against the Vorthon was being won, but the victory was changing the fundamental nature of galactic politics. Human methods had saved civilization, but they had also introduced concepts of warfare that challenged everything the galaxy thought it knew about conflict and ethics. Admiral Kyungsu commanded the largest fleet in galactic history as it approached the Vorthon homeworld. The final battle would determine not just the outcome of the war, but the future structure of civilization itself. Ships from dozens of species formed a massive armada that stretched across millions of kilometers of space. But the decisive weapon was not the combined firepower of the galactic fleet. Instead, it was a single human vessel, commanded by General Na Young, carrying the most sophisticated psychological warfare equipment ever developed. The plan for victory did not involve destroying the Vorthon homeworld, but rather fundamentally changing what it meant to be Vorthon. Dr. Yu Jin had spent months preparing for this moment. Her team had developed a method for broadcasting the concept of individual identity directly into the planetary hive mind network. The technology could theoretically reach every Vorthon consciousness on their homeworld simultaneously. The risks were enormous. If the broadcast failed, the Vorthon might adapt and develop immunity to psychological warfare. If it succeeded too well, it might cause the complete collapse of Vorthon civilization, leading to chaos that could destabilize the entire galaxy. Captain Dong-Hyun positioned his ships around the Vorthon homeworld, while human psychological warfare specialists made final preparations. The planet below was a massive organic structure, more like a single living creature than a traditional world. Every building, ship, and piece of technology was part of the collective consciousness. The broadcast began with a simple human concept: the idea that individuals could exist separately from the group. For species with individual awareness, this seemed obvious, but for the Vorthon hive mind it was a revolutionary and terrifying possibility. The effects were visible almost immediately. The organic structures on the planet's surface began to change, as individual Vorthon drones started making personal choices. For the first time in their species' history, some areas of the planetary organism stopped functioning as their components developed independent thoughts. The cascade effect spread faster than anyone had predicted. Billions of Vorthon minds that had never experienced individual consciousness suddenly found themselves aware of their own separate existence. The hive mind that had controlled their empire for millennia began fragmenting into countless individual perspectives. Captain So Young monitored the communications from the planet's surface. The transmissions were unlike anything in Vorthon history. Individual voices speaking about personal experiences, fears, and desires, the collective consciousness that had once coordinated their entire civilization was dissolving into chaos. Some Vorthon embraced their newfound individuality immediately. These beings began exploring concepts like personal choice, creative expression, and individual relationships that had never existed in their society. Others were terrified by the isolation of individual consciousness and desperately tried to reconnect with the failing hive mind. The military implications became clear within hours. The Vorthon fleet defending their homeworld lost all coordination as individual ship commanders began making independent decisions. Some continued fighting while others attempted to negotiate surrender. Several ships actually began attacking each other as former hive mind unity collapsed into factional conflicts. Admiral Jae-won received surrender offers from multiple Vorthon commanders who no longer felt connected to their Empire collective mission. These individuals expressed concepts that had never appeared in Vorthon communications before: regret for past actions, curiosity about other species, and desire for peaceful coexistence. But the transformation was not universal. Large sections of the Vorthon population resisted individual consciousness and attempted to maintain collective thinking. These groups became increasingly desperate and dangerous as they watched their civilization fragmenting around them. Colonel Minho coordinated the humanitarian response as reports came in of Vorthon individuals who were suffering psychological trauma from their sudden transition to individual awareness. Many could not cope with the isolation of personal consciousness after living their entire lives as part of a collective mind. Dr. Eugene established treatment centers where former Vorthan drones could learn to function as individuals. The process was difficult and not always successful. Some beings never adapted to individual consciousness and eventually died from what could only be described as psychological isolation. The end of the Vorthan Empire came not through military conquest but through internal transformation. The hive mind that had made them a galactic threat simply ceased to exist, replaced by billions of individual consciousnesses trying to understand their new reality. General Nayung oversaw the post-war occupation, which was unlike any military operation in galactic history. Instead of controlling conquered territory, human forces were essentially teaching an entire species how to think as individuals. The task required psychologists and social workers more than soldiers. President He-jin addressed the reformed Galactic Council from the chambers on Sanctuary. The war was over, but the challenges of peace were just beginning. The galaxy now contained billions of former enemies who were struggling to understand concepts like personal identity and individual choice. The Vorthan fragments that successfully adapted to individual consciousness became valuable contributors to galactic society. Their unique perspective, as former collective beings, provided insights into cooperation and coordination that individual species had never considered. But many galactic civilizations remained suspicious of the transformed Vorthan. The idea that an entire species could be fundamentally changed through human psychological warfare raised disturbing questions about the nature of identity and consciousness. Ambassador Tae-hee worked to establish legal frameworks for dealing with artificially created individual consciousness. The former Vorthan drones, who had been given personal awareness against their will, posed unprecedented challenges for galactic law and ethics. Some species argued that the human victory was actually a form of genocide against collective consciousness. Even though individual Vorthan were now peaceful, the original hive mind culture had been completely destroyed. The transformation raised questions about cultural rights in species, autonomy. Captain Ji-woo commanded the new Galactic Security Force, which included both human tactical experts and reformed Vorthan individuals. The combination proved remarkably effective as human strategic thinking was enhanced by Vorthan understanding of large-scale coordination. The galaxy gradually adapted to its new reality. Human military doctrine became required study in academies across known space. The concepts of psychological warfare and consciousness manipulation were now permanent parts of galactic military science. Admiral Kyung-soo reflected on how much had changed since the first desperate call for help. The galaxy had been saved, but the methods used for salvation had fundamentally altered the nature of civilization itself. Traditional concepts of honorable warfare seemed quaint compared to human innovations. Dr. Eugene continued her research into consciousness and identity, working with former Vorthan subjects who provided unique insights into the nature of individual versus collective awareness. Her work laid the foundation for new fields of study that would influence galactic science for generations. The human fleet that had once shocked galactic observers with its aggressive appearance now patrolled former Vorthan space as protectors rather than conquerors. But the galaxy watched nervously, knowing that human capabilities in warfare had only been partially revealed. Some species began developing their own versions of human tactical concepts, while others focused on creating defenses against psychological warfare. The technology that had saved the galaxy was also creating new forms of military competition between former allies. President He-jin established the Institute for Galactic Security Studies, where human military experts would train officers from other species in advanced warfare concepts. The goal was to ensure that the galaxy would never again be vulnerable to existential threats. But the institute also served as a way to monitor human military development. Other species wanted to understand human capabilities, not just to use them, but also to defend against them if necessary. The saviors of the galaxy were also its most potentially dangerous inhabitants. Commander So Young took charge of the humanitarian mission to help former Vorthan individuals integrate into galactic society. The work was difficult and often heartbreaking, as beings struggled to understand emotions and relationships that had never existed in their previous collective existence. The transformation of the Vorthon, from galactic threat to refugee population, created unprecedented challenges. Billions of former enemies now needed food shelter and psychological support, while learning to function as individuals. The cost of victory included responsibilities that no one had anticipated. General Nayoung established the Human Defense Council, which would coordinate military responses to future threats. The organization included representatives from other species, but human tactical doctrine remained the core of galactic defense strategy. The galaxy had been saved through methods that challenged every previous assumption about warfare and ethics. The victory over the Vorthon proved that survival sometimes required abandoning principles that defined civilized behavior. As human ships continued their patrols through space that had once belonged to the enemy empire, the cosmos had to AC